Welcome back from the break. This session will now focus on data privacy and breach, prospects and trends for 2021 and 2022. And our moderator is Harsh Walia, partner from Ketan & Co. Now, Harsh is the partner in the New Delhi office of the firm. He is a leading lawyer in the field of technology, telecommunications, and data protection, focusing on complex regulatory and legal matters. He has advised various foreign-based and Indian clients on issues related to data protection, privacy policy, ISO standards, conducting data protection-based due diligence to ensure compliance, and advisory on best practices, advisory related to cybersecurity-related obligations, and security practices. Harsh has been involved with government in the discussions on upcoming data protection law. He has authored several articles pertaining to data protection which have been published by renowned journals and leading publications. Harsh holds a GDPR FAS certification as an associate member of the IACCM. Recently, Harsh has also featured in the list of ALB's top TNT lawyers 2021. He has featured in the 2020 Business World 40 Under 40 Elite list of lawyers and legal influencers in India. So let's welcome Harsh. Yes, Harsh.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Thank you for the wonderful introductory remarks, Julian. And thank you all the panelists and attendees for joining us today. It is my pleasure to moderate this session concerning this very crucial topic, which is data privacy and breaches, trends and prospects for 2021 and 22. So, undoubtedly, data is a prized possession today, and it's not just the government, but individuals are also taking a lot of care and focusing that the data is utilized properly and processed properly. So, with the growing importance and discussions around data protection, there is certainly today we are going to have this discussion around this critical issue, and data is at the forefront everywhere these days. So, with this, I will introduce you to the excellent panel that we have for the discussion, starting with Anish Bhatnagar, who is the General Counsel India at BT. We have Belson Devarajan, who is the Director Data Privacy Lead in Asia Pacific region for Cognizant. We have Chandan Pani, who is the Chief Information Security Officer for Mindtree. Then we have S. Chandrasekhar, who is the Group Director of Government Affairs at Microsoft India. And we have Smita Chandrasekhar Ayya, who is the Director Legal at Harman International. So before I kickstart this session, please note that the views expressed by the panelists here will be considered as personal and not of the organization that they work for, and it should not be considered as a legal advice. The flow of session will be that we will have 45 minutes of panel discussion followed by 15 minutes of taking questions from the audience. So you can drop in your questions in the dialog box, which we will take up at the end of the session. So we have divided the session into three main parts, starting with the PDP bill, SHREMS 2 and its impact on data transfer, and finally data breaches. So starting with the first topic, PDP bill, I would say that in the past 2 years, we have seen simmering discussions around overhauling the data protection framework in India, and the PDP bill was formulated. This bill was supposed to be listed for discussion in the monsoon session, which is about to end in the Indian Parliament, but it did not, and it is most likely will be introduced in the winter session, which is still 3 to 4 months down the line. So, with this background, I would like to bring in Shekhar into this discussion and ask him about the global policies and structuring of the global practices for MNCs, considering that India is far behind in terms of its regulations compared to some of the other advanced countries, and where there are stringent and robust laws that are already applicable to the processing of personal information. So, in this context, I would like to ask him how do MNCs with this different laws and different standards adopt their policies so that there is uniformity, or is it a good idea to have different policies for different countries? Over to you, Shekhar.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, and thanks, Harsh. So I'll start from the philosophical plane and then come on to the technical and the implementation level. On a philosophical plane, yes, it on the surface it looks very, very complex. There are so many geographies. Sometimes in countries like the US, even within one geography, there could be various laws. There are different kinds of regulators who want different types of data to be treated very differently. So it seems to be quite a complex situation. But when we peel the onion, as they say, uh, some of the common principles like respect for human rights, the importance of safeguarding privacy, the importance of privacy as the bedrock of trust and trust in technology. These are some of the common principles on which we can build this edifice. Now, with these common principles, again, if we go to the implementation level, what typically happens is we create what is known as a data lake, which is nothing but an amalgamation of all the data that an organization has. After that is done, one has to basically classify and tag data. For example, in a certain geography, the age of consent may be 14. In another geography, the age of consent may be 18. In one geography, health records might be very sensitive. In another geography, it might not be sensitive. So once you are able to tag the data, then you are able to have rules engines as to how that data has to be treated. In the Indian context, for example, if you have critical personal data that is not supposed to leave the Indian shores, so if the data is properly tagged, then it will not leave the Indian shores. You can create a rules engine. There are other kinds of data which can leave India for processing but need to come back. Again, you need to create a rules engine that this is a payments data. There is no problem of it leaving the country. After processing, it comes back and then it resides in India. So this is the way we have been able to handle the diversity which exists in the different data regulations. But yes, uh, at a different plane, when we see it, it is creating a very unequal, skewed kind of world. It's only very big players, very big cloud players who can have such sophisticated practices, and it will soon allow the aggregation of all these services with these sophisticated players. I'll stop here.
Sure, I think that's a very important insight, and the solution seems to be technical and automation. And you very rightly pointed out that not all organizations will be able to do this. I think what comes to my mind is that as an organization grows in size and its business, it has to invest appropriately in data protection, privacy, technology, and automation as well. I think that's the takeaway for us here. So I'll move on to impact of shrimps too, and maybe I'll bring in Belson here, who is a data privacy lawyer and had advised clients on various data protection laws, including GDPR. So Belson, in light of Shrimps 2 judgment and the subsequent EDPB guidelines on this, could you share your views how it has impacted the business which rely on cross-border data transfer, especially from the EU? Belson, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry. Hope I'm audible now. Yeah, thank you. So, shrimps as such, we need to see the OECD 80s. This concern with regards to cross-border was already raised by OECD in the 1980s, where computer was becoming a norm of doing business, where data was moving, especially transatlantic data. Europe and US are natural partners where data has to be. And, the very famous French surveillance on France by United States, especially on the nuclear program. And even though they are natural partners, the Europeans and the Americans, they do spy each other. As we speak today, I read in BBC that Berlin, between UK and Berlin, there is some espionage, and one person is arrested. So even though it is a union, even though there is so much of commonality between these neighbors across Atlantic, there is also constant surveillance happening. So we need to go back to the OECD, the 1980s, but this was raised as a concern as early as 1980s. And then computer-related processing became more and more very common across. And destinations like Philippines, India became very cost effective, and you have the world-class talent. The data getting moved out of the European Union or moved out of Americas became very common, especially after the 2000s. So for those who have worked in various IT and IT-enabled sectors, the HIPAA, the Data Protection Act of UK, the 1998 one, then came the 2016-18. These are all very common things, and we didn't have a legislation as such. Now, coming to SRIMS, it's a common knowledge that the data transfer between Europe and America was challenged. The Safe Harbor, then came the Privacy Shield. And in between, the European Parliament asked for the European Court of Justice to give an opinion on the Canadian passenger data. So if you look at SRIMS as such, you need to see the seminal case laws of SRIMS 1, the opinion 1 of 15, then SRIMS 2. One benchmark which these two judgments and one opinion has given is the essential equivalence. And I'll just step back. The human rights is a universal right. That's what all the countries who have accepted within the UN Charter, signatories of the UN Charter, and for us in the Indian context, the Indian Constitution, and I know for the same reason with the Philippines, with China, even China to a large extent, have accepted this as a principle. So post SRIMS 2, the culmination of all these case laws, one thing which is running as a denominator across is you have to have a standard of human rights as we have. That's what the European Union is telling. That's what SRIMS 2 is telling us. Now, how do we do that? Obviously, we know there were several recommendations, like the recommendations 1 of 2020, etc. Now, coming to the last point, how do we as a nation, and we are the biggest processor in the entire APAC, and China may be the, Philippines may be the second, distant second. How do we do that? It's a $1 million question. One and only thing which we can do is the Indian Union and the European Union should sit together and talk in their best interest. And now India being part of the Quad, the Australia, Japan, economic cooperation, it is high time that India gets into a bilateral agreement with European Union, because I know adequacy is going to be extremely difficult under 45.2, and it is also going to be very difficult to change a lot of things. But if these two unions sit together and talk to each other, I think it will be in the best interest. Now, leaving this to individual companies, controllers and processors to assess a host country's law and do something, it is extremely challenging. I hope the industry bodies across board sit together, both from the European Union and the Indian Union, sit together and iron this out. It is in the best interest, especially in a COVID-19 situation. Thank you, Harsh.
Thank you, Belson. I think you have given us a very nice historic perspective as well as the current perspective, and putting it very beautifully that European Union is asking us to follow standards of human rights that they follow, and they want that to be implemented across the globe. I think that's a very beautiful way of putting things together and giving us direction how this can be settled, considering that there is a lot of data flow that is happening from the EU to India. So I think moving on and something very similar, I'll ask Smita to jump in because the points that Belson has put forth, do you think we have these regulatory developments in EU impacting commercial transactions in Indian businesses as well? Smita, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Harsh. Good afternoon and good evening to everybody. And first of all, before getting into the privacy slash legal aspect, I'd just like to give a quick status quo update. Right, I mean, what's happening right now in the APAC, especially in the COVID era, is that there's a lot of digitalization that's happening. Right, I mean, you've seen industries like fintechs, and then these online platforms, the e-commerce platforms trying to do more and more business simply because people would like to get everything done at the comfort of their home, right? And then you also have these other supporting businesses which are actually thriving today thanks to these digitalization and so on and so forth, right? So that's where we are today. So what this simply means in the privacy world is that there is a lot of data that's being churned out, right? So there have been companies in the APAC who have set up shops everywhere in the world because everybody wants to expand their business, right? So that's where lawyers like us sort of come into play and help these MNCs address the practical problems. So now coming back to the privacy aspect, there are two things here from a data protection and privacy perspective that I'd like to talk about. One is transfer of data from the EU to APAC, and also the vice versa, right? So you have these two aspects. So as far as transfer of data from APAC to EU is concerned, it is straightforward but not easy. I say straightforward. It's the only reason is because EU is a very developed market. You have GDPR, so you know what to do, what in terms of readiness. You know the risks associated. You know the commercial impact. So you will do what needs to be done, right from having your data transfer agreements in place to putting a robust compliance, program in place, or enhancing the existing compliance programs that you have in order to, scale up to the EU expected level and so on and so forth. Last but not the least, commercial preparedness in terms of hefty penalties that the regulators in the EU actually levy on the MNCs, right? So these are some of the crucial points that one would look at if there is a data transfer from the APAC to the EU. So that's like quite straightforward, right? Now, the other way around is where humongous challenges arise, right? So day to day on the ground, people like us actually face, practical problems. So let me just quickly get into a scenario. I think that'll, help ease most of the points, right? So imagine that there's a data transfer from a company in India or anywhere in the APAC, which is about to, move to the, so the other way around, actually. I mean, imagine there's a data transfer happening from one of the EU countries to the APAC, right? So what is it that that company needs to bear in mind? Actually, there's no one size fits all kind of an answer, unfortunately, because APAC is a very dynamic jurisdiction, right? I mean, you've got more matured economies like ANZ region, for example, and you also have Singapore and Hong Kong in the Asia region itself. And then you have some economies like China, India, Malaysia, and all, where there is something happening. And then, but then it's yet to scale up to the EU level, right? So the dynamics are actually different. So first thing that comes to my mind is obviously the contractual obligations, where your data transfer agreements can cover most of the things. And also there are these SCCs, standard contractual clauses, which I'm sure like in the privacy world, everybody is familiar with. But unfortunately, SEC is not an answer for everything, right? I'll give you another, a practical challenge that we faced recently. We've got all these SECs in place, good data transfer agreements in place, but we were stuck with when we hit the road, right? Because there are certain laws, local laws, I mean, in certain countries, which actually require certain personal sensitive data to be revealed. Now, that is directly in contravention with your GDPR or with your SECs and, whatever is happening in the EU. So how do you go about, right? So I think the one of the best possible ways to deal with this is to obtain individual consents, which can actually help you to quite an extent. But that's not a foolproof answer, though. But that helps solve the situation to a great extent, right? The next one is, obviously from be it an M&A that you're doing, or be it a general commercial transaction that you're involved in, you would need to again scale up your compliance programs, right? I mean, you would need to bring in certain things which did not exist in the past, depending on the nature of your transaction, depending on the country that you do intend to do business with, and so on and so forth. So that's the other thing. The third most important thing is, my dear friends, as I mentioned, APAC is a very dynamic region, right? And then there are these governments which have like heavy political influence on whatever regulation that's coming into play. So that's the major point of pain, I would say, or a concern, because that's where the key lies. Because in the name of national security, I do not want to name the jurisdictions for obvious reasons, but some governments actually do pry heavily on all sorts of data, right? So how can you stop that? There's no way. No matter how much our protection that you have, I don't think that will stop any government from doing whatever it needs to, right? And the other thing is data localization, which at least in the countries like China and India, people are facing issues because I mean, if the data has to be localized, then there are a lot of economic and also cyber security impact which the MNCs actually have to consider. So this is the other aspect. And of course, last but not the least, there are in terms of way forward for APAC, I think Australia is leading by the example, because they don't really, the Australian laws actually don't really look at the controller and the processor, right? For them, the accountability is important. Ultimately, I think that's the way to go for APAC jurisdiction, because as long as you can hold somebody accountable for some kind of a breach or fraud, I think that is the key here. Because it doesn't matter which part of the supply chain you are in terms of privacy. So I think these are a couple of practical elements that I wanted to touch upon. So, and apart from that, the most important thing, like Belson and Shekhar said, where in APAC, unfortunately, not all the laws actually spring from the basic concept of human rights, right? I mean, there are various elements like culture, economy, and also the mindset of the people, and depending on the geography, what is the need of the hour. So it's actually constantly changing, though we will get there someday, in terms of having a sort of a unified sort of a legislation, like Belson said, in conjunction with the EU regulator discussion, hope to really get there someday. Thank you.
So thank you, Smita. I think this was a very comprehensive answer. You took into account all facets of data transfer, not just from EU to Asia Pac, but vice versa as well. And I think you touched upon a very important topic of surveillance law in between. And that is what I thought I'll discuss a little bit in more detail with maybe I can pull in Anish Bhatnagar into this, because he's a telecom lawyer, and he should be dealing with surveillance laws day in and day out. So and this is a requirement, that an assessment as per Schrems 2 that every jurisdiction must undertake on surveillance laws applicable in various countries. So in that context, Anish, will you let us know what are the type of surveillance laws in India, and are they properly backed up by statutes and their enforcement? How do you deal with those laws? So your perspective on surveillance laws in India, Anish, over to you.
Well, thank you, Harsh, and thank you everyone else. Fascinating conversation, a good topic actually. I think there is an understanding that there are surveillance laws that are there in every jurisdiction. I think what's important for us to understand is that what are the safeguards available, because and this is sometimes a misconception, because people don't always understand that there are safeguards and there are things that we can exercise, and we can there are questions that we can ask and answers we can seek. Broadly, I have three categories in which I'd like to talk about. One, I think, is the Telegraph Act, which is what applies to telecom companies. anybody who takes a license provide telecom services. The second is a bit broader under the IT Act, which does include telecom companies because of the use of the word intermediaries there, but also other individuals who control, in the words of the Act, a computer resource. And which is, again, all of these is very broadly defined to cover anyone who has any data that's stored or transmitting, receiving data on a computer or a computer network. So I'll start with the Telegraph Act and the telecom laws that apply to networks in the country. And broadly, there are two levels. One is the Act and the rules which are framed under the Act. And then there are license terms, which actually then further refine that as to how do you actually implement the surveillance. I'm going to call it interception and monitoring mechanisms. So the Act enables and provides the grounds on which interception and monitoring can be done. There are 5 broad categories, and those are the categories you have to strike if you ask for interception and monitoring in India. The first is sovereignty and integrity of India. The second is security of the state. The third being friendly relations with another country, public order, and then prevention of incitement of any offense. Now, all of these make sense, but there is judicial precedent on each one of these. There are parameters drawn, and there's a lot of case law on this to say what actually what would it be included in sovereignty, integrity of the state. In fact, the underlying basis that before all of these can be implied is that the grounds are that it has to be on the occurrence of a public emergency or the interests of public safety. And there's actually also a case law that says that the interests of public safety has to be looked at in the context of occurrence of public emergency. So it can't be disjointed from that as well. Now, if we move down to how does this really and practically apply, there is a comprehensive rules set out, as to how can you actually trigger these interception capabilities. The rules require of officers of adequate seniority. Typically, there'd be home secretaries in the central government or the state government. They need to give reasons in writing. They need to evaluate alternative options available before they can trigger this. There are time frames to be followed. There are strict confidentiality requirements. There are requirements for destruction of data. There's also a review committee which is required to be set up, again of senior oversight. And within, I think it's almost within 15 days of the first order being passed, it goes to a review committee, and the review committee's job is to see whether or not you're following the rules or the grounds have been satisfied. The orders for interception remain in force for 60 days. They can be renewed, but then they cannot be renewed beyond 180 days. Coming a notch below as to license terms and in practice, what's happening in the telecom industry and how does it apply here is that there's something called lawful intercept and monitoring facilities which are required to provide the government of India. So there is a centralized location, and in that centralized location, we set up a facility in which you have the ability to extract information and provide to the government, provided there is all of these rules are met. There's a warrant provided to the nodal officer. There are a bunch of rules which are followed, and with fairly strict sanctions. That used to apply about till a couple of years ago in practice, but what we recently moved on to is an additional overlay onto the lawful intercept and monitoring systems, which is called the Central Monitoring System of the Government of India. This system has been set up, which basically connects your lawful intercept monitoring within the telecom company onto the central monitoring system. So there's no manual intervention required. There is a direct connection to the LIM facility, the LIM I'm using for lawful intercept and monitoring. There's an automated process for the orders. There's an electronic provisioning of the targets. There's no manual intervention. Now, you can obviously understand this would have caused some questions. So there were some further safeguards which the government announced in a press release of 16th of July. And they said that no direct approach by law enforcement could be made to the CMS authority. You'd have to go through the CMS authority, which would enable the request in compliance with the law, but the CMS authority would not have access to the content. So there were again rules that were set out in the use of the CMS. There's also some SOP which is set up, which unfortunately is not available in the public domain. So very, very broadly, to recap on telecom and telecom laws, there is a capability, there are very potent safeguards, and there are rules that are followed for every surveillance and monitoring requirement in India. The second place that this ability exists in under India law is the IT Act. Now, there's a section 69 for those interested in reviewing this later on. You can ask intermediaries and persons in charge of a computer resource, again on the same grounds which are there in the telecom laws, but with one change. So if you recall, there were 5 grounds, but there's one additional one here, which frankly, it does pique my interest as to why this is an add-on, because everything else is the same. And that add-on to sovereignty, security of state, public order, all that stuff is, it can be sought for the investigation of any offense. I think this will also have to be read conjoined with the others above. I don't think it would stand alone separately, which is what the understanding is. It would have to be investigation of offense in the light of integrity of India, security of state, public order, and all of that bit. But this somehow gives the impression it could be much broader and much wider. Now, what is really required here? The obligation here is to provide facilities and technical assistance to computer resources, interception, monitoring, decrypting of information, providing information stored in the computer resource. And this is, again, a very broad requirement on people who own and control computer resources. The second thing I'll talk about in the IT Act is around monitoring of traffic data, which is more about cybersecurity provisions. This is where, to enhance cybersecurity protection in the country, identification of cyber threats. They use the word computer contaminant in the legislation, which is basically a word for a very broad term for computer viruses and all forms of it. And how this is done, again, is there's a order passed from the person in charge to make facilities and technical assistance available. Both of these, again, have there are penal provisions here. In fact, there's imprisonment for both of these, the IT Act requirements. I will not delve deep on some of the disclosure requirements, because that's not directly onto the point in CRPC and other bits. But the last thing I want to talk about very briefly was one around executive orders. There's something that's got some litigation in action, which is that there are certain executive orders under Article 73 of the Constitution that the government has invoked. And these are in discussion in Parliament. Not much is known about these, but these are essentially around some programs that the government runs for anti-terrorism activities and for network traffic analysis for keywords. You look for keywords that you want to further investigate. NatGrid is one of the programs. Then there is NITRA, which is called Network Traffic Analysis. So again, this is something that not much is known, but a lot of questions are being asked. This is not something which is not above scrutiny as well. And lastly, I think one of the most important points is, ever since the Supreme Court has held right to privacy as a fundamental right, not saying that's inalienable from right to life and liberty, all these laws that I've spoken about have to meet the test of legitimate aim, proportionality, and procedural guarantee against abuse. And any of these provisions, and you'll see a lot of this activity happening in the country going forward, that any of these provisions can be struck down both for unconstitutionality or for procedural infirmity. So a very interesting space for us to look at. Quickly to summarize, I'm conscious of time. I think there are surveillance laws, there are adequate safeguards. There is some judicial activity that's happening to ask if those safeguards are being taken care of, a very standard of procedure in a democratic society. So yeah, a space to watch out for. So thank you, Harsh. Over to you again.
Thank you, Anish. I think this was very comprehensive, and thank you for taking us through so many legislations and executive orders in a short 3-4 minute time that you got. I really appreciate. It looks like there are enough safeguards under the Indian statutes, at least. But yes, as you rightly pointed, there are other executive orders which may not be available in public domain to the extent that everybody is aware when any surveillance activities take place. But I think very recently there has been some litigation also in the court challenging all of this. And that is the sign of a democratic country, and something more useful and beneficial for the people will come out definitely from these litigations, and the law will be settled in near future, I believe. So thank you, Anish, for this sharing your views here. So I'll move on to the third topic, which is data breaches. And I think almost all organizations have at some point of time struggled on this. And there are reporting requirements to by CERT in India. And many have said that data breaches and responses obligations need to be strengthened more. So with this, I will like to bring in Chandan, Chief Information Security Officer. And my question to you is, how should organizations in India devise a strategy to respond to data breaches if the prevention or preventive measures they have adopted have failed for some reasons? Over to you, Chandan.
Thanks, Harsh. Good afternoon, good evening. And I must say, interesting topic today. It's a lot of good insight from different industry bodies. See, coming back to data and data breach, right? First, let me tell you, data breach is not a new occurrence. Data breach is something which is there with us for almost 35 years now. The first data breach that officially recorded was way back on 1984, if I'm not wrong. Credit card data, almost around 90 million credit card transactions were published somewhere in some of the credit card companies back in 1984 in the US, right? Now, from those days, we are struggling with the entire process of data breach, right? And second one, while preparing for data breach, the official method that we follow today is quite bookish. So when we say bookish, there is a cookie cutter available with all of us, right? I'm not a lawyer. I'm part of security industry. So if you ask me what is your SOP to respond to a data breach, I have a SOP to follow, right? And the SOP very clearly says that what is my preparation, what is my identification methods, how I contain, right? How I ensure that the forensics are done, and what is my recovery. And finally, probably somewhere I also mentioned about notification. But that is something which is probably the concern that we have today in the industry. You look at a practical scenario. What happens when actually something goes wrong, right? Now, all we talk about is how much data is it on darknet, who is the handler, right? How quickly I can do a forensic. Do I have a retainer service with me, right? Can I pay through cryptocurrency? Bitcoin could be something else. How quickly I can recover, right? These are the practical challenges which we have when we talk about data breach. But if you look at my SOP or the cookie cutter for preparation, all these things are not there, right? So there's a huge gap between what you prepare and what actually happens in the ground, right? If you go back and look at any of the large data breaches in last couple of years, the informations were widely available on darknet before even the company knew, right? And that's what we knew, that something went wrong somewhere, and the whole process starts. That is something is the real concern when you prepare for the data breach as a control, right? The third thing, okay, so going back to my previous point, I think I always say that it is like you prepare for football and you get into a hockey match. That's what happens when something goes wrong. Now, the most important part, I think Shekhar also spoke about data tagging, right? How you tag the data. Now, before you tag the data, can you map a data in an organization? Let's say we are talking about ITS organization, right? Couple of million assets across the world. IIoT, IoT, God knows what else, right? Do we know today where exactly the data is? That is what is my first question. You map it first. Then let's go ahead and tag it. So discovery is my first requirement, right? Where exactly the data is today, right? And which is kind of an impossible task, knowing We are talking about workloads on cloud, hybrid, on-prem, off-prem, God knows what else. Now, one more subject that we miss during the entire process is insurance. Cyber insurance is such a critical aspect of the entire process, but due to whatever reason, right, a lot of organizations are not yet there to understand how much and when to go for cyber insurance. The next one, as a country, we are not that sensitive towards the retainer or forensic service, right? If you look at other countries, the forensic service is a default service which is available for your data breach. But we are yet to go there. Barring few top-notch companies, I think nobody else currently following a retainer model or a forensic model. Now, third thing, what we entirely miss, we always prepare the plan on the basis that it is like I always say unknown kind of entity. I'm preparing for something which I'm not sure when it is going to happen, how it is going to happen, right? Now, the scale of the breach. If you look at any of the past breaches, the scale is something which is beyond our imagination, right? People are talking about tons of data, millions of records, right? And how it goes out of the organization, what happens when that large scale data actually is there on a public forum, how you respond, how you deal with that. That is something which we don't practice, right? So my take on this, particularly this subject, is our preparation is quite bookish. Now, coming to the next million-dollar question, what if the preventive measure fails and there is a breach, right? Now, I always advise my team, my opinion is this: let's follow a 4-step approach. One, your data is owned by somebody. It could be individual, it could be customer, right? And as Smita mentioned, probably we are the largest data processor, or I think Belson also mentioned the similar lines, that we are the largest processor in the world. So knowing that, it is very important to notify our customers. So first is ensure that the customer piece is taken care. Right? Your resources, notifications, instructions, whatever we need to deal with, we need to deal with. Second most important aspect, that is your forensics, right? We need to understand exactly what has happened, right? It is not that what is visible to me is exactly something like that has happened. Typical data breach happens over the period of time. If you look at Marriott, something was discovered probably a couple of months after the original breach happened, right? So some other organizations, typical time frame, or in our world we call it as SLA. Typical SL for a data breach is somewhere between 120 days to 180 days. So that is the time frame when the breach is actually happening in somebody's network. So what exactly has gone wrong? How much data? That is something second critical step to understand, right? And obviously the legal impact based on what data, what kind of data was there. And the third is notification requirements. Now the third aspect is how you contain it. Once you understood that how much data was there and you know whom to inform, the third thing is how to contain it. Do I need to deploy any additional controls, right? Audits, checklist, recovery mechanism. That is something operationally we're quite strong. Now the last aspect what we miss, and this is something very important, is media management. If we're not going to do that, this message is going to be all over, right? Now, right set of communication is very important. It should not happen that the entire world is looking at some threat intel which is coming from darknet by a bad guy and interpreting what is happening, right? Now, and the final point, keep a watch on your stock price also. If you're not communicating right way, definitely it hits your stock price, right? And these are practical challenges we deal with.
I think, Chandan, this is very helpful because you have taken us holistically to different angles, reviewed it from different angles, and actually, I can see how difficult your line of working is because you're always fearing the unknown. You don't know how it will come and what the implications will be. So, really appreciate your deep insights into this. We just have a couple of minutes left, and we'll have one rapid fire round quickly. You will just get 30 seconds to answer. And the question is, what is the most important practice that should be implemented for ensuring data security? You have to just give one important practice. Starting with Smita, you can start.
Me being a lawyer, definitely, standard contractual clauses, tighten them as soon as, as soon as you can. And also make sure that, there are other form of documents, be it your policies or be it your, side letters or, obtaining consents. So make sure that the written documentation is rock solid. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Shekhar, over to you.
Zach. Yeah, so in my view, the most important critical success factor would be awareness. So awareness across the organization about the seriousness of the issue and the persistent threat that the organization faces. So that is what we as an organization also do. Once there is awareness, 3/4 of the problem is resolved.
Thank you. Chandan, over to you.
My take, there's no single bullet. It has to be a framework, right? First, know the data, where it is stored, how confident that we can trace the data back, who is accessing, why is the access is there, right? And based on all this, you decide a technology framework to cover the entire data that you have.
Sure. Thank you. Belson?
I will use the European Court of Justice's response. Treat the data equally every time, everywhere you access it. That's very much the European Court of Justice. So whether it's in the network, whether it is in your laptop, in your email, in a printed form, in a purge table, in a scanned copy manner, wherever it is, treat it with dignity, treat it with equality. So unless you follow this, the data will get exposed in one way or the other. And one thing also we all have to agree and accept is no data is absolutely secure. Even the best possible method can be penetrated. Good example, Pegasus. But as Chandan rightly mentioned, your good security framework, your good privacy governance framework can solve most of our problems.
Thank you, Belson. Anish, over to you.
Yeah, so I agree, and I don't think there's not anything from a legal point of view that I'm too concerned about. I think what Chandan said resonates very well with me because I think for a lot of IT tech companies, data security is something used as competitive advantage. I think I'm just going to focus on one simple thing: is information security management systems. That's something you need to have a proper program, and that is something we really need to make sure we have that in place.
Sure. Thank you, Anish. Over to you, Julian, if there are questions from the audience.
Yes. Unfortunately, I think we've run off by about 2 minutes. Maybe let me ask you one question. Do you think all provisions of the PDP bill will be notified together? If not, what provisions will require compliance first? That's one of the questions that came in.
Right. Shekhar, the question is, do you think all provisions of PDP bill will be notified together, or will there be provisions that be notified first and rest can come later, if I heard that correctly? Anyone can take can respond.
Okay, I can take that. We have a precedence in South Africa, and South Africa took quite a long time to implement. So I definitely don't see Indian government insisting on all. We'll go, like GDPR on 25th May, we'll go one go. No, that's not going to work in the Indian scenario. And especially, I strongly believe that they may have segregation with regards to private players, public players, with exceptions, notifications, then creating the authorities in a phased manner. And some of the provisions with regards to sensitive personal data, I'm very, very confident that they may go first from the protection standpoint, from the security standpoint. But I personally strongly believe that the government of India might give 12 to 24 months minimum. They may take the South African model, and they may take at least 12 to 24 months to bring in the enforcement.
Sure. Thank you, Belson. I think I completely agree because we don't even have a data protection authority right now to constitute it and then to roll out some of the best procedures and practices. It is going to take time. So thank you very much. Julian, do we take any other questions or should we close it here?
Yeah, I think we should close it here.
All
Harsh,
right.
do you have any final words or summary for the session that you'd like to share with our audience?
So I would just say that I found this session very useful in terms of getting perspective from lawyers, data protection officer, information security officer, and all of this is very useful, especially for us when we are facing the new data protection legislation, which will be a reality very soon. So with this, I hand it over back to you, Julian, for any further closing remarks. Thank you very
Okay.
much, all the panelists and the audience for watching us. Thank you.
Thank you, Harsh, for that. And with that, we've come to the close of this session. Once again, thank you to our moderator and panelists for sharing their insights on what is really quite an important issue. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.